YouTube begins new wave of slowdown for users with ad blockers enabled. It's not just you. YouTube is slowing down your PC if you have ad block installed by making your CPU sweat, likely as part of its draconian war on ad blockers. YouTube been sluggish lately? Turns out the site's increasing the CPU usage of ad block users, and it could be intentional. YouTube's new policy, slowing down for ad blocker users. YouTube is slowing down load times for users with ad block. YouTube ratchets up ad blocker crackdown by slowing down load times. YouTube is loading slower for users with ad blocks yet again. YouTube made the site intentionally lag really hard for people who still use AdBlock. What a scumbag company. Bad news, guys. You've all been lied to. Your computer hasn't been slowed down by YouTube. In order to understand this chaos, first we need to break down how ad blocks work, then we need to see who is affected, and then finally we can diagnose the root cause here. So let's dive in. The first piece of how ad blocks work is content blocking. It's a pretty obvious concept. You take a set of URLs and you tell the browser, hey, don't load things from these. So if I'm scrolling through an article on a random news site and there's a bunch of embeds from ads.google.com, just don't load the responses and those ads will never appear. The issue is that those boxes might still be there. And also, you can work around this trivially. Instead of getting the ads from ads.google.com, maybe I get them from my website's domain and I redirect some part. The problem here now is that if I'm an ad blocker and I block your random URLs that you're getting these things from, but you use those for other stuff, that can break the whole site. If I have to go to /user to get my user profile info, but you also happen to serve ads out of /user, the ad blocks can't block that. As such, method 2 tends to be the most popular way ad blocks work for the majority of content. This method is quite different from the first, where instead of looking at the network request, it actually looks at the page content and removes elements based on certain characteristics. Usually they're going against a list based on that website's domain that says, hey, on Twitter, ads have this shape, they have this content in their elements. You can use that to hide the element. Or they just have the word advertisement or sponsor in them, and now they'll get automatically hidden. I've even experienced this building web pages or just demo sites and putting the word ad in an element and having uBlock block it while I'm working on it on my own machine. It's strange and almost funny how hard these tools try to block anything that even resembles an ad. It's even funnier how companies have worked around this. I remember back in the day, if you tried to select the text that said advertisement on Facebook, you couldn't because they would break every letter into its own elements and also insert other ones in between so we could read it and it would say advertisement, but a computer couldn't read it because the elements are broken up in a way where it's non-trivial to parse and figure that out. This has been a two-sided war for a while, a crazy cat and mouse game, where on one side, we come up with more and more clever ways to block ads, and on the other side, we come up with more and more clever ways to keep them from being blocked. This is where method 3 gets really interesting, because video ads behave entirely differently when you consider how video streams work. I'll give the example of Twitch because that's what I'm most familiar. If you don't already have the context, I worked there for a few years. To start playing video on Twitch, you have to make a request for what's called a manifest. It's effectively a list of where to go to get the next data. Usually when you get that list, it will start with an advertisement because an ad needs to play before the rest of the content will play. And the chunk that you get has a little bit at the end that tells you where the next one is. So if you don't get the advertising chunk or you choose to skip the advertising chunk, you'll never get the information for where the next one comes from. There is a catch though. Twitch has a limited number of ads they can serve. So if you just request over and over and over an infinite number of times to get a manifest that's first chunk isn't an ad, you can start playing that one instead, and there will be no ad in it because there just wasn't an ad that time it was served. If you do this over and over again, or just write code that constantly fetches over and over until eventually you get one without an ad in it, you've blocked the ad as far as the user is concerned. We've also massively increased the impact on the user's device, network, and also the servers that are serving these things. You've effectively built a mini DDoS into your Chrome extension to get around this one way of doing ads. I want to be clear as can be going forward. I'm not against ad blocks, even though they take a decent bit of my revenue and I've had to spend a lot of my time working around them. I think they're a net good, to say the least, and I personally still run uBlock the majority of the time I'm browsing the web. It's important that creators can make revenue, sure, but it's also important that you're safe online, and a lot of these tools help with that. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that ad blocks are some evil here to destroy us. I will say that two particular extensions, AdBlock and AdBlock Plus, are a little bit sketchy, and you should use uBlock, but we'll get to all that in a bit. Because right now, we need to talk about who was affected, which, as I might have hinted at a bit there, was primarily AdBlock and AdBlock Plus users. uBlock Origin users were not affected by this. Brave users were not affected by this. The users of most ad blocking tools were fine, but AdBlock and AdBlock Plus had some pretty sketchy problems. This is why these articles are so frustrating. Because the first thing I would check if I was writing an article about how YouTube is hurting users because they're using an ad block is check which ad blocks people are using that causes this problem. It was apparent very early on, before almost any of those articles were published, that this was only affecting those two ad blockers, which, by the way, Adblock and Adblock Plus, they're basically the same code. They share a ton of resources. They're owned by the same people. Do not use those. They're not good. We'll talk about the performance and other parts of why later. First, I want to talk about a certain developer, Gorhill. He's the creator of uBlock and uBlock Origin, and he was very quick to jump on this controversy. There's a lot of chatter in the last days about how YouTube is slow with content blockers. Those performance issues affect only the latest version of both Adblock Plus and Adblock, and it affects more than just YouTube. uBlock Origin is not affected. See issue tracker here for Adblock and Adblock Plus. Reminder that both blockers are owned by the same entity and use the same filtering engine. Using both at the same time makes no sense. This is actually an important point. If you're running multiple ad blockers, please stop. Like, there's no point at all. If you just have one, ideally just have uBlock Origin. We'll go over that more in a bit. I investigated the performance regressions, and the cause is mainly distinct code paths, and it affects many sites, those for which the problematic code paths are triggered. This is kind of obvious, especially if you think back to the example I gave before, where if you just fetched over and over again from Twitch, eventually you might get a response without an ad. Imagine you never do. That code is just going to run infinitely in the background and cause your performance to be awful. And we definitely saw users with Adblock installed that did that having performance issues on Twitch. And I'm sure this is common in all of these ad blocking solutions because they're full of weird workarounds that are constantly parsing the page, making network requests, and doing all these different things to hopefully hide the ads from you. There are so many ways an infinite loop can happen that causes a massive spike in your CPU. And there's basically zero chance this is happening from YouTube's side. And even if it was, there's literally zero chance this is intentional. Yeah. Also, if you have both, the performance is worse because the bad code is running twice as often. Hilarious. It feels incredibly underhanded for Google to push some code that silently just wrecks performance. That's an incorrect diagnosis. In the current instance, the issue is specifically Adblock Plus 3.22 and Adblock 5.17. All browsers have profiler tools. This is important. If you're already a web dev, you probably know about this. I was having some problems in Arc, so I'm going to quickly demonstrate this in Chrome. You literally just press Command-Option-I or right-click on the page, and you can trivially open up all of these tools for debugging a website, including performance tools. If I click this, I click refresh. Now it's going to run and profile against the page to see what actually happens when you load it. And we'll see in here all the different things that took time down to the line of code that was running at a given point. As such, it's somewhat trivial to dig into what's causing these performance issues. And while I don't expect a journalist to know about all this and take the time to do this, I do expect them to reach out to people who might be able to, or at the very least, wait until there are real sources that confirm or deny the accusations going on here. I'm very disappointed in how the media has covered this instance because it's pretty trivial to identify this problem. It has nothing to do with Google or YouTube and everything to do with the Adblock extension you're using. But they took the opportunity to shit on YouTube all over the place. And while there are definitely things YouTube could be doing better, I think they're doing a fine job with this. And it's incredibly frustrating how people excitedly jump on misinformation just to jab at a company they don't like. Adblock and Adblock Plus had already identified and confirmed this issue over a day before the 9 to 5 Google article happened. So there was no excuse for these articles to be coming out with this misinformation. Any amount of research would quickly point to the fact that this is because of the extension. Here, Gorhill takes the opportunity to do one of my favorite things, which is point out just how bad performance is in Adblock and Adblock Plus. This article's almost 10 years old, and it was the motivation for him to create uBlock originally. Because the things all of these sketchier ad blocks were doing were just destroying your performance. He shows here the example of Adblock Plus using an absolute absurd amount of memory when uBlock Origin uses almost none. So the Adblock Plus default config uses 550 megs of RAM, and the uBlock version uses 182 total. That's less than half the amount of memory being used. You're going to feel a performance hit there. And Adblock and Adblock Plus make your browser slower. uBlock can sometimes make your browser faster. I think about this chart a lot. The fact that uBlock Origin is multiple times less CPU usage than any of the other ad blocks is hilarious and should be enough of a reason to stop using these sketchier solutions. And here's yet another example where he has Adblock and Adblock Plus, and he's using over a gig of memory for this random tab. That's insane. You shouldn't be using these sketchy ad blocks, and you certainly shouldn't be using both at the same time. Free ad blocker and best ad blocker. How do people download these things? One important question to ask would be, why now? Why did this just suddenly happen all at once? Well, Chrome extension devs probably know about the current change with the manifest. Google's working hard to move us away from the version of extensions known as Manifest v2 over to v3. It has different protocols and methods for requesting permissions for things. It restricts how early you can get access to the page. It's generally meant to make extensions a little more safe and consistent, but it also limits what extensions can do. That said, in a couple of months, v2 extensions will no longer be supported and everybody has to be on v3. So we're seeing a lot of Chrome extensions start to migrate piece by piece over to the new model. And in doing such, they sometimes break things. And that's what we saw here. In their efforts to move from Manifest v2 to v3 and make some changes along the way, they broke things really badly and caused a massive news cycle because their sketchy extension did some sketchy stuff during a sketchy rewrite. Gorhil also pointed out that he's seeing some users reporting it with uBlock Origin still. He has written up a really nice guide on how to confirm if uBlock Origin is actually the source of your problem. Every single time someone reported an issue with performance on YouTube with uBlock Origin, it turned out that the problem wasn't uBlock Origin, it was something else. Like down here, where someone said that they had to disable Opera's internal ad block, and then that fixed YouTube, because Opera's internal ad block is copying a bunch of code and sources from AdBlock and AdBlock Plus, which causes it to have the same regression. Almost all of the examples of somebody experiencing this with a competent ad block like uBlock have been because they also are running another ad blocker. And I have so much sympathy for Gorhil and all of the frustrations that he has had trying to jump in front of this, because it's obnoxious. He made a solution that works really well and solves this problem, and now both him and YouTube are being dragged when neither had anything to do with this. uBlock works great. He solved this problem. We should probably listen to him. That's all I have to say on this one. If you can't tell, I'm incredibly frustrated. I love crapping on Google when I have the opportunity. This isn't one of those opportunities, though. I'm disappointed in my fellow tech journalists for covering this the way they have. Y'all can do better. I know it because I've seen you do it before. Don't just report on something because it went viral on Twitter. And if you do decide to report on these viral things, do a little bit of research first. That's all I'm asking. If you want to watch me crap on Google a little bit more, I'll pin a video in the corner there where I do that. That's all. See you later. Peace, nerds.